This is HighIntensityBusiness.com with Lawrence Neal, helping you achieve your health and fitness goals. Become a great personal trainer and build your high-intensity strength training business.
Lawrence Neal here, and welcome back to HighIntensityBusiness.com. Today's guest is John Little. John is considered one of the top fitness researchers in North America, an accomplished author in the field of exercise, including titles like Max Contraction Training, Body by Science, The Art of Expressing the Human Body, and most recently, The Time Savers Workout, and books in philosophy, history, and martial arts. John's articles have been published in every major fitness and martial arts magazine in North America. John, welcome back to the show.
Well, thank you very much, Lawrence. Nice to be back.
You're welcome. And it's good to be able to do a part two to talk about your latest book, The Time Savers Workout. I thought we were going to be able to discuss it in one podcast, but as these podcasts generally go, we kind of delved into some rabbit holes and went pretty deep. So we only really scratched the surface. And I actually prefer that because it's much more enjoyable and deep conversation that way. But where we kind of got to last time we spoke was talking about the conservation of energy phenomenon that you talk about in the book. And, you know, we covered that quite well, I think. It was really interesting what you had to say about, you know, how you might want to change routines if you're not, you know, activating those higher order motor units. One of the things I'm really curious about, and it's something that I have discussed on the podcast before, but a long time ago, last time I can remember talking about it, is this phenomenon we see in clients where some people, after a high intensity training workout, and it would seem regardless of the protocol, just don't seem to exhibit the symptoms of exhaustion. You know, they're not breathing super heavily. The heart rate might not be as elevated. And I've seen this with people I've trained. You know, I've put them through workouts similar to a workout I would do, whereas I would be, you know, carpet time, and they would not exhibit anywhere near the same degree of symptoms. And I wondered, is this a product of a lack of, you know, novelty in the stimulus, going back to what we discussed at the end of our first conversation on this? Or is this a specific genotype which just doesn't seem to react in that way to exercise?
That's an interesting observation. I personally believe that it is probably that the client has simply adapted to the stimulus. Like their body has done what the body is supposed to do, which is to make any activity that you do habitually become less demanding, you know, especially on the energy systems. I know that I've had people that are dedicated high intensity trainers that have come up and tried, for example, the Max Pyramid protocol. And it's like someone hit a switch. You know, people who normally are quite stoic and very good and get through the end of the workout and don't display the typical symptoms that you've described will maybe shy of carpet time, at least display, you know, a pronounced aerobic effect. And also, it's self-evident to them that they're not up to doing another set of an exercise, at least not, you know, within the, you know, immediate 10 minutes or so after completing that. So I just think it's the severity of the exercise and also sort of acclimating to the protocol that they have been doing. You know, I remember years ago when we used to follow sort of the Nautilus / Menser protocols, that we would be just gassed, done. And yet the more I did them, the less demanding they became. I was able to get through them, in other words, and I was able to do the forced reps and the negatives. But to me, and I could be wrong, certainly, that it almost seemed like a performance art at that point. You knew what you were supposed to do. You knew what your symptoms were supposed to be. So when you had your training partner, you know, assisting you with the forced reps and then ready to stand by with the negatives, you'd almost start to dial it back during the positive rep portion. So you could save a little for the forced reps so they weren't as demanding. And I think that's just part of the body trying to protect itself and its energy reserves. So I too have noted that not everyone hits the carpet, and I'm one of those who doesn't believe that's necessary, to be honest. Yes, when you hit the carpet, that's symptomatic of someone who was burned through a tremendous amount of glycogen, and your body is then in the process, as you know, of gluconeogenesis, and that requires not outputting energy at the same time your body is trying to produce energy. So you tend to get signals from the body to stop outputting energy so it can do its job. So in my opinion, anyway, I think that to answer your question, I don't know if it's possible to answer it briefly at this point, that I think it's simply an adaptation to a familiar stimulus.
Yeah, this is interesting because I've heard very experienced trainers in here talk about how, and obviously this differs. I mean, some people would think this was a terrible idea and not appropriate, but I've heard some trainers who will put someone through a traditional high intensity training workout and then maybe stick them on something like a Carol bike to do,
Mm-hmm.
intervals, high intensity interval training in order to kind of get them to that point where they are, they are exhibiting those sort of symptoms of exhaustion, is the only way I can think to put it. So I'm thinking, is that, would you consider that to be a suboptimal way of doing it, or just rather they should actually perhaps review the workout and amend the workout as opposed to throwing in this other protocol at the end? Or perhaps we're splitting hairs. I'm just curious.
Yeah, it could be a bit of hair splitting. I don't think it really matters to the body. It can't differentiate between all out effort on a bike or an all out effort on a leg press. So they both represent sort of an anomaly in the training system, and that's what it adapts to. I'm embarrassed to admit that a few weeks ago, my wife had a bunch of topsoil delivered to us for a garden that she wanted to do. So my day consisted of, slugging topsoil into a wheelbarrow and unloading it. And I was sore for the next 3 days, unlike any of the workouts I've done recently. But it was a novel enough stimulus that more fibers were brought in. My body overmobilized the forces necessary to do it. If I were someone who did that for a living, it probably wouldn't take anything out of me, and my body would have learned to, use just the precise amount of fibers at just the time needed to for all the shoveling and the moving and all of that. But I'm the furthest thing from a laborer that you could find. So it represented a novel stimulus to my body, and I certainly felt it. So I think we get hung up on our little cliques, and I was guilty of that as well. That the weight training is the best in that. As long as resistance is applied to the muscles from some source that is making the energy output greater than you're accustomed to, there will be an adaptation. And that's really what our target is the adaptation. I do think that where resistance training comes to the fore is that you can, if you sort of adhere to the fundamental principles of high intensity training of proper form and intense effort and consequently a relatively brief workout performed infrequently, that you've got a tremendous amount of liberty as to the modality that you might choose to solicit this response from the body. But I don't know that it benefits anyone to be locked into just one protocol. Let's say, for example, that we're only going to use Nautilus machines. Well, so what's that mean if you're traveling? And you don't have access, that suddenly there's no workout that's worth performing because, I don't have something that was designed by Arthur Jones back in the late 70s. There were tremendous physiques that were built prior to this period of time. There's been tremendous physiques that have been built without access to that equipment. So what is present, I think, in all of those scenarios is that the adequate stimulus was applied to the muscles and the body made an adaptive response to it. So, I don't think it hurts at all if you wanted to work your legs in a high-intensity interval training on a bike. Not at all. But that's just my opinion based on my observation of doing this for a living, the past 15 years or so.
No, I appreciate it. So, again, in the book, you talk about a number of protocols, and I was very surprised to see you bring up multiple set training.
Oh, you mean the DeLorme-Watkins method?
That's right. The 3 sets of 10, I believe. Because, obviously we're all taught in high intensity training, single set to failure with maybe some advanced techniques like forced reps, negatives, as you were saying just now. And so to see that was almost like, oh, what's happened here, but I also appreciate that you were coming from the place of, well, not everyone is maybe, if I can remember the sort of gist in the book was, look, not everyone's perhaps going to want to work that hard in a single set. And maybe some people do need multiple sets to get there. Do you want to, about me going on, would you want to just talk about, why you decided to include that protocol or that option within the book?
Well, there was a period of time when we first opened our facility that it was 1 set to failure, and it was real legit failure. And it was a handful of exercises in the high intensity method. And people, raved about how they felt and how hard the workout was. But what I found as a trainer in not dealing with, as trainers and people that are fascinated and interested in high intensity training, we tend to gravitate to people of like mind. So it's hard work. That's the way to go. But there's what we kind of lost sight of is that the average person isn't part of that group. They don't really care about that stuff. For a lot of people, they've never experienced demanding muscular work as, say, an athlete might, in practices where they sprint or in hockey where they skate as hard as they can. They know what it's like to hit fast twitch fibers. They know what the metabolic byproducts are of severe lactic acidosis and windedness, and in some cases nausea. And they just see that as going with the territory. But to the average person who, at age 40 or 50, looks at themselves in the mirror and says, "Whoa, boy, I really let myself go. I've got to do something." And you throw them right into the deep end of the pool. Not only is the experience tremendously unpleasant, but to them, they don't really get that this is the best way to go. And it is a trainer's job, admittedly, to try and educate the client as you go along, so that perhaps over time they'll understand intellectually why our approach is the way that it is and why we believe it's a better way to go. But at the time, high intensity training is one of a dozen options of exercise from their perception in exercise. And it's a smorgasbord. And at one end of the spectrum, you've got, going for a walk. To them, that's exercise. You and I might look at it and go, how can you call that exercise? It's not very demanding. It's not a full range of motion. It doesn't use a lot of muscle fibers. It neglects the upper body entirely. But to the average person, a walk it's physical activity. Not contrary to what Ken Hutchins tried to educate us about, exercise and recreation, which I think was a valid distinction. The average person hasn't read that. They don't read the super slow manuals. They haven't read the works of Mike Menser or Arthur Jones or any of these advocates. So you've got walking, you've got maybe kayaking, you've got hiking, you've got running. You've got various classes from yoga to spinning to Pilates. You've got high intensity weight training. So to them, they're all the same. It's all physical activity. So, the pitch on the first one is you go for a walk, the blood circulates, you feel a little better. Fair enough. That's walking. With kayaking, well, you're working your upper body and you get that same feeling and you're burning some calories. And then you come to us and we say, you're going to feel like you're going to puke and your muscles are going to be sore for 3 or 4 days afterwards. And it's going to be, 60 seconds of pure hell when you're working out on that leg press or the squat. And then we're going to do it again for, various upper body muscle groups. And to them, they're thinking, well, this isn't very pleasant. On this panorama of exercises that I have laid before me, this is not something I can see myself wanting to do, over a period of time. So as part of the educational process, people that are not accustomed to getting or even what the milieu is like of fast twitch muscle fiber activation and what it's supposed to feel like. I found that it was a step in the wrong direction to simply just have a baptism by fire. Some people simply didn't like it and they quit. Now, these people are still going to quit when there's demanding muscular work because they just simply don't care for it. And that's a very human attitude. It's almost programmed into our DNA to be averse to high muscular energy output. So I totally get that now. At the time, I thought it was important to beat them over the head with the truth. But what I found with 3 sets of 10 is that it was a nice way to ease them into it. The first set is not demanding, but it does serve the purpose of warming up muscles, which in some studies, including those done by DeLorme and Watkins, they felt was important in order for the body to then proceed into a higher energy output or higher muscular effort set. The second set, also uses slow twitch fibers, but it also begins to tap the intermediate twitch because it's a little bit heavier than the first set was. And then by the time the third set comes around, which is really our one set to failure, if you will, they're all in. But it's gradual. It's not bang, you're going to hit that set right out of the gate. And really, in the big picture, 3 sets is really, as opposed to running for 5 miles, is pretty minor. You're talking about maybe 30 repetitions, which some people, back in the old days, they do a set of 20 rep squats, breathing squats, and that was 1 set. So if you're basically doing that, but with a pause in between after every 10 reps, if you will, on this. So I don't really see DeLorme and Watkins as being divorced from high intensity training. In fact, if you look at some of the earliest high intensity protocols that were put forth, it was usually there were 3 sets involved per muscle group. If you actually went through the workout and saw which overlap occurred in different muscle groups. But I don't know that every time you step into your car you have to put your foot to the floor. It doesn't. I don't think that's necessary. It's good to know that you can do it. And I think it's important that you do stimulate fibers such as fast twitch fibers that you don't normally activate on a daily basis, because otherwise they're going to go away. But I think it's just in the approach. And there's some people that just respond better to bringing it in gradually. And even still, if I put someone on the DeLorme and Watkins method, their workout lasts in the neighborhood of 10 minutes. So it's still, to me, falling under the banner of intense, brief, and infrequent.
What proportion do you have all your clients go through the DeLorme and Watkins method then, as opposed to starting them off with a single set to failure?
Yeah, I do now.
Wow.
In fact, that's how I normally start most clients these days, is with the DeLorme and Watkins, and then we peel off with variation thereafter. But I always like to have the DeLorme and Watkins as sort of a baseline for people to return to. And if you think back, most of us who bought our first home barbell set and worked out at home, whether it be from York or wherever, the York system and the Weider system and the Billard system and all of these other barbell courses were basically a handful of exercises for 3 sets where you worked up and weighed each set. It was all based on DeLorme and Watkins for the most part, but it was by the bodybuilding standards of the day, it was considered a beginner's approach. It was where everyone else was doing specialization and 20 sets of body part. You were talking about 3 sets, which is very low. Mike Mentzer used to do 5 sets for his biceps, when he was back in the 70s. So this is still a very, very, it's briefer than what he did. And yet what he did was considered high intensity training.
When you said he'd do like 5 sets for his biceps, that he would do like 5 different exercises, like a pull down, a row, a bicep curl, something else.
No, when he did his, the way he did his routines back in the 70s, when he went to a split routine, he would train, for example, chest, shoulders, and triceps. So let's say triceps. He'd do press downs to dips. That was his superset. But he'd do 2 of those. There's 4 sets. And then he'd finish off with 1 or 2 other exercises. 1 or 2 other sets of a different exercise. So, maybe some days he did 4 sets, maybe other days he did 5 or 6. But that was what he did. Same with the chest. Menser was always consistent with that. It was some form of a fly followed by some form of a press and a superset or pre-exhaustion set. And he would do that for 2 cycles. And then in some cases, he would add another exercise for whatever purpose. So, and that was considered high-intensity training, and it was also considered anathema to most bodybuilders who looked to Arnold and other people to do 20 sets of body part because he was only doing 4 or 5. Even when Mike was training for the Mr. America, he was training his whole body 3 times a week, but he was still averaging between 3 and 5 sets of body part.
Yeah, it's easy to forget how much volume in terms of sets they used to do back in those days.
Well, yeah, and I mean, that was how Mike trained. Now, over the years, he much like DeLorme and Watkins, reckoned that a lot of those sets were unnecessary, and so he began to discard certain sets and just focus on what we would call the work set. So the amount of sets that he performed and the amount of sets that he certainly recommended to his clients diminished over the years. But the actual exercises and, that pre-exhaustion sequence remained. I mean, he always recommended to his clients an isolation followed by a compound for muscle groups such as the thighs or the chest or, in some cases, the back. So, DeLorme and Watkins, to me, I always sort of saw that as, 3 sets of 10, roughly is still being in the high intensity group. It's the extremists, I think, that have said, no, it can only be 1 set. Well, no, it doesn't have to be just 1 set. And I think your own psyche has to match what you're doing with the soma. If you're going to stay with it, if every day every morning I came to your house and I said, come on, Lawrence, we're going to go do hurdles down at the local high school track. I might be able to get you out there once or twice, but by the 3rd day, you're not going to answer the door for me because it's just it's just A, you haven't recovered, and B, it's too demanding. And we have a natural aversion to high energy output activity. And we have to also recognize that we're a very, very small percentage of the population that loves high intensity training. And most of us who love it the most are the ones with the worst genetics for it. So we want to do everything possible to milk out whatever gains we can in terms of muscular development. And we burn tens of thousands of mental calories in figuring out what the perfect way to do this is. And we don't really look that much different for our labors, either mentally or physically, because of the genetic component. So when you recognize that most of our responses are genetically mediated, the big concern at that point is, or should be, how can I do what is required to build or to preserve, as many muscle fibers as I can safely? And in that respect, I think high intensity training comes in because there has always been an emphasis on proper form, that the resistance is always under the control of the muscles rather than outside forces such as momentum. So it's safer. It stacks the odds on our side that we can still continue in our endeavor to stay fit and healthy with less chance of incurring an injury.
What about for yourself? When you work out, what do you do? Are you a single set to failure guy, or tell me a little bit about your
pretty much.
Workouts.
Mainly because by nature I'm a lazy person, so I like getting what I can with the least amount of sets, that I can. So it's usually 1 set is my preferred personal way of training, but I have used 3 sets before, and sometimes I'll do a variation on that in an interval type fashion, meaning that I will pick a weight. Typically, it would be the lightest weight of the 3 sets that you're going to do, let's say in a DeLorme and Watkins method, and perform a 30-second interval as slowly as I can. Rest 30 seconds, use the same weight, and go at a medium or a natural tempo in 30 seconds. and then I'll rest a final 30 seconds, and the final set will be done as a sprint. It's work per unit time, as much work per unit time as I can squeeze out, which would make it, by the definition of intensity as prescribed by Dr. Arthur Steinhaus many, many years ago, that it is the amount of work you perform in a given unit of time. And so I'll do that. And then I'll do the same thing with another upper body movement. Well, 2 upper body movements and a lower body one. Typically, I won't do more than 3 sets in a workout, or 3 exercises in a workout. Yeah.
So you typically do like a big 3 or big 2?
Yeah, big 3 usually. Yeah. Yeah. And then, and then I play with protocol a bit, as long as it's still true to the fundamental tenets of what we would consider high intensity training.
So going back to the book for a moment, you talk about in there you talk about health span and longevity, and you talk about how you can, improve health span and improve quality of life with high intensity training and with the protocols discussed in the book. But you didn't seem so optimistic about someone being able to improve their lifespan. And that was interesting to me, because I thought that, that you've got some people claiming that, we should be living to 120 or around that, maybe higher or maybe longer, if it weren't for, the bad lifestyle choices that everyone's making. And I'm just curious, have you got, do you not agree with that? How do you think about that?
I honestly think most of these things are genetically prescribed. I mean, living to 120 seems to me a fantastic projection, which is not based on evidence. I mean, you'd have to have a colony of people that are living to 120 on average to even make the assumption that that's normal for human beings. I mean, normal for human beings 100 years ago was 47. That was sort of the average age that people dropped off at. There were still people that popped through to their 80s back then, but they were in the minority. Now our lifespan seems to be about 80, 85, maybe. And I don't know that, if you're more active or you do more sets or you're, whatever, that contributes to a longer life. I do see that it contributes to more wear and tear, which can lead to an arthritic life, which is not compatible typically with being healthy and a long-term existence. But I think anyone that makes a claim that, that they're the new Ponce de Leon, that they're going to find the fountain of life and it's, going to failure on one set of a curl is ludicrous. I think longevity is genetically prescribed. I think health to some degree is genetically prescribed. And I think muscle size and cardiovascular capacity is also genetically prescribed. So it's just a question of what, given that we're not going to probably live much beyond 80, if we're fortunate, the question then becomes, well, how can I do that in good health? Because I don't want to spend my 60s, 70s, and what I have of my 80s, miserable and immobilized and unhealthy. That should be the primary factor as to how do you maintain your functional ability as long as you possibly can, while at the same time mitigating the chance of injuries and wear and tear issues and force problems that can come back at the body. So, I mean, perhaps you're privy to evidence I haven't seen that shows that some form of exercise or some form of diet is going to protract human lifespan, but I haven't seen it.
No, not evidence, just opinions. Which don't hold
usually
quite the same way.
Most people that have opinions that favor that we should be living to 120 that are selling something. They're selling a diet, they're selling a supplement, typically. But to me, I mean, who's done the long-term studies necessary to make a conclusion in that field?
So I think I understand what you mean, and I agree with much of what you said there. But so one thing on this. So are you saying that if, let's say, genetically someone should live to their 85, a given individual, right? Do you agree though that obviously that individual will cut that short if they don't do certain things, or if they make bad lifestyle choices. Are we in agreement on that? Or
I suppose we would be in agreement on that, but to me, the only examples I can think would be egregious. A guy's going to smoke 8 packs of cigarettes a day. Okay, probably not a good decision.
What about a terrible
if you want to
diet?
live long? Well, I don't know what a terrible diet is, to be honest. I mean, if someone just eats chocolate cake all day, okay, well, maybe that's a problem because now he's not getting the vitamins and minerals that a balanced diet would otherwise provide him. But the whole area of nutrition, and I said so in the book, is to me, it's like a religion for people, and they're very zealous about it, and I mean, there's some people now that advocate a diet where you don't eat, and it's, that's supposed to be really good for you. You basically catabolize your own tissue, and it's.
Well, let me state it clearer. So I think, well, I believe that, if when I say bad diet, overeating, for the most part, probably, high calorie foods with, that are going to cause perhaps a lot of inflammation in the body. If they are, if they contain a lot of polyunsaturated fatty acids and, all sorts of different preservatives and things like that. Low in nutritional density, that kind of thing. I'm being careful not to say as long as they're low carb or ketogenic or whatever. But you know what I mean? That kind of thing. High in refined sugar.
But these are extremists, right? And you can never prescribe something for the norm by the extreme. I mean, if you think of people like where you live in Ireland, is everybody just eating Snickers bars and
no, of course not. But what I mean is the obesity epidemic we see, right? So we see lots of people who are obese all over the world, and they are, overeating and eating the wrong things, probably, which is causing overconsumption. I appreciate that's a whole nother argument, but that's not the point I was sort of trying to make. The point I was making is there are people who are, they have a bad relationship with food. They seem to be over consuming. They are very overweight. And let's say that same person doesn't exercise either, so they're losing a lot of muscle mass. They're experiencing sarcopenia, osteopenia, all of that, all of the negative, the downsides of not exercising. So surely, if that person is someone who, if they did address all those things, would live to, let's say, 85, they're now going to perhaps live till 60. Is that not valid? Do you not agree with that? That's what I'm curious about.
Well, I mean, my first answer, not claiming omniscience, is to say, how do you know these people aren't living to 80?
Well, I guess some of them are, but I'm assuming some of them are going to cut their life short.
Then the exception disproves the rule. Like I say, we like correlations. That's just the way our mind works. But I mean, if you see a guy who's, and again, you've presented me a perfect storm of problems here, right? So we would believe to be problems, and saying, well, surely this fellow, should, take heed and change his ways. But if that same fellow lives to be 85 and has hit the average, well, who's to say? Maybe he would have been 90, if he changed his diet. But he still hit the average. And I just haven't seen the data for us to stand back in judgment on that and say, aha. Now there are certainly ER clinics that are filled with people with metabolic syndrome and diabetes and all things that come from the type of individual that you described. And yes, that's not healthy. And that will certainly, I would presume, lead to a shorter lifespan.
Right.
But again, to me, it almost seems like a perfect storm of problems.
But it's quite common.
Well, there is certainly a lot of obese people, but I don't know that all of them are at the point where their lifestyles are threatened by it. And again, here's another interesting one, and I'm just speculating here. This is not a code that I live by any means. But who's to say that the body can't make adaptations to that? I mean, we have people that have heart problems, and the body figures out a way through its own stem cells and everything else to circumvent certain arterial systems in the body. It's phenomenal. There's so much of the body we don't understand. And if there is a threat that's imposed upon it, the body's natural response is to try and make an adaptation to it, including, I would presume, problems that would arise from bad lifestyle choices. I don't know that. We're just talking. But the problem is, to me, again, it's the Voltairean statement. Cherish those who seek the truth, beware of those that find it. As soon as someone comes up with this is the way, and everyone must march in lockstep to this, I tend to lose interest and I take a step back. Seeking a solution is great. I love that. But when someone figures this is it, can go no further, we figured it out, my radar goes up a little bit. And that's just the natural skeptic in me, I suppose. But if someone says, here's a fellow who's going to overeat, and here's a fellow that's going to smoke 3 packs of cigarettes a day, and here's a guy that's going to drink a 40 ouncer of gin every day, versus a guy that eats more moderately, drinks occasionally, and doesn't smoke. Okay, well, that guy is clearly, the latter guy is probably going to be healthier. There's no question about it. And as health correlates to longevity, he probably will live a longer life. But certainly in the community I live in, there's a lot of people that consider themselves, I'm overweight, I'm this and that, and they are. But they'll live as long as the next person, who's running triathlons. Maybe live longer because of the inflammation that comes from the overuse activity that attends marathons and things like that. So I don't know. I don't know that any of us is standing up high enough and looking down over the human race to offer definitive prescriptions for what people ought to be doing. I do think there are some strong suggestions that if you can preserve, as well, you mentioned sarcopenia, if you can do what you can to stave that off, your metabolic health is going to be greater. If you don't overconsume, your metabolic health is going to be greater. Whether or not those things absolutely positively every time correlate to longevity, I can't say.
Yeah, interesting. This is it's almost like, if I've understood you correctly, it's kind of like you're saying that the someone's genetics will supersede those other factors. So let's say even if they do make some poor lifestyle choices, for what for a catch-all kind of phrase for this, because I think there are things we would all agree on as being like bad for your health, and lack of exercise and overeating and eating the wrong things will be part of that group,
for sure.
And so, but you're potentially saying that there are individuals who might make bad choices. I'm just trying to keep this simple because it can be so nuanced. Who may have poor quality of life, like pain, poor functional ability, et cetera, but they will still live. They could still live to their intended lifespan. So if the genetics determine that they're going to live to 85, then they'll still live to 85. They just have a shittier time in the last 30 years.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So
I mean, and again, this is my opinion, and I'm a voice in the wilderness here. There could be people that specialize in studying various groups, but it's funny. Even when you look at some of the studies, they usually are ripe for critique. We like certainty. We like direction as human beings. And so we tend to gravitate toward those who are very assertive in those respects, whether it's the science community or whatever. And so we want those answers. And when they give them to us, we take it as gospel. But, genetics to me is the trump card. Why aren't you 7 feet tall? Why are your eyes the color they are and not some other color? Why do some people get lung cancer who have never smoked a cigarette a day in their lives, where other people who smoke 2 packs a day never get it? These are bigger pictures, genetically speaking, than, why aren't my biceps 17 inches in circumference? When I tape them, why can't I, play hockey as well as Sidney Crosby? These genetics is the big trump card, but it's also one of these things that's not really malleable, despite certain enthusiasm for subjects such as epigenetics, it really doesn't have that big a deal. It doesn't make that big a deal. I mean, what they're saying in some cases with epigenetics is that switches get hit that otherwise would not get hit depending on your lifestyle choice.
Right.
But to my knowledge, a lot of that is a really microscopic view of the fact that if you are born into a household where you grow up with, Oreo cookies and beer and all of this, that you're probably going to be fat like your parents were and have metabolic problems like your parents did, because that's the environment that you're in. So, you can say, well, yeah, but it's hormone signaling and it's the flipping a switch. It is what it is, but it's at the end of the day, it's the environment that you are in and that you grow up in and that you accept as a norm, and that and consequently, if you have morbidly obese parents, there's a very good chance that the children that grow up in that environment will be likewise. And it's also true, to your point, that if the kids at that point break away out of that environment and through a severe focusing intellectually on moving in the other direction, can maybe eradicate or at the very least diminish that byproduct of the environment, that they will, by our standards, they'll look better, and they will probably be healthier. But whether or not they will live longer, I don't know.
Interesting. Okay, cool.
How's that for being a contrarian? Yeah.
No, it's it's interesting. I mean, it's just given me. I will definitely. Well, I'll have to re-listen to this when I set up the blog post, and I will. I mean, I'm looking forward to doing that because it's just something I enjoy kind of contemplating and thinking about.
Well, the thing is, the important thing, at least, and it could just be something that's very peculiar with me, is that I always to be an individual in terms of a free thinker, you've got to question everything, including things that seem self-evident, and have reasons. And there's going to be adequate reasons in some situations to us that we feel it's indisputable. That just makes sense. I mean, don't be crazy. Of course, eating a well-balanced diet and staying away from junk food and living a proper lifestyle and exercising adequately, however you choose to define that, is necessary for health. But to me, it's like Socrates said, the unexamined life is not worth living. You got to look at your reasons for it. And are those reasons in and of themselves sufficient to move you to act in the manner to support those reasons? Or is a lot of this just simply, presumptive or knowledge that we think we have that is going to be subject to change upon more evidence coming into the physical sciences at some point yet to be determined in the future? I mean, if you look at the history of science, it's a history of changed opinions. Each conclusion is a tentative hitching post based on the knowledge that we have, and our only means of acquiring more knowledge really seems to be, non-contradictory information. That if there's one important rule of logic, so-called, it's going to be the law of non-contradiction, because as I mentioned earlier, the exception disproves the rule. We're looking for rules. We're looking for proper ways to behave. But if you have one exception to that, then it's no longer cause and effect, because cause and effect should be right across the board. And it seldom is, unfortunately.
When's the last time you experienced that, where you saw something a certain way, and then you saw a contradiction, and it kind of, you had some kind of cognitive dissonance, and you maybe re-examined that? Do you remember?
I can't tell you the last time that it happened, but it's happened enough to me that I've seen it as a pattern, and I've tried to correct the hasty generalization tendency in my own thinking. Because, I can give you an example, and that was any one of the protocols that I had written about earlier. I mean, when I first wrote about max contraction, I was convinced, based upon the evidence, that was the best, bar none, training protocol that one could do. It made sense to me that muscles are weaker in some positions and stronger in others, and that the body recruits and thus stimulates fibers according to perceptive need. If I give you a pencil, only the amount of fibers required for you to hold that pencil will come into play. If I give you a transmission, many more fibers are going to come into play as a result of weight. And it also dawned on me that your optimal leverage configuration was where you were able to produce the most strength, which is why, for example, in a bench press, when your arms are almost fully locked out, the weights you can support and contract against are incredible compared to when your hands are down by your shoulders. You can't produce much force there. But then you'll get someone like a Bill DeSimone who has studied moment arm issues and says, well, it's not entirely true. At the top, the moment arm is minimal. But when your arm's at a right angle, the moment arm is maximal, and therefore the force required by the muscles is much greater. I can't argue that. That's true, but I can also tell you, if I give you the amount of weight that you can support or contract against when your arm is at a right angle to the body in a bench press for 45 seconds, and let's give it a number, let's say it's 50 pounds. And then I take you up to almost the locked out position of a bench press, and now you're using 300 pounds. So I can tell you that the metabolic effect is way greater when your arms are locked out. It's night and day. Your body knows how many fibers it needs to support a certain weight. And you can say, well, yeah, the moment arm's minor, and there's a bit of bone on that. There is, but if there were no muscles on your body, your bones by themselves cannot support that weight. So clearly the muscles are maximally involved. And this is the way my thought process went. And so it also stood to reason that, if you were to push a car out of a ditch, your legs and your arms are going to be almost in the fully extended position. Why? Because you can generate more power that way. You're not going to put your arms back to your chest and go into a full squat to try and push a car out of a ditch because you can't generate sufficient power to do so. So given that your body knows that, how much force it is being asked to produce, you want to put it in a position where it can produce that. And if your body is capable of contracting your muscles, let's say in the bench press against 300 pounds, and you give it 50 pounds, you're not fooling it. Again, I was convinced on that, but I also recognize that it's a cute argument, but I don't possess exhaustive knowledge. So when you read about physics issues, which again seem indisputable, it gives you pause. And it did certainly in my case with things like max contraction, caused me to go and consider what Bill DeSimone said and come up with like a max pyramid protocol, which takes advantage of maximum moment arm. And I've had tremendous responses from that, from applying that. But if anything, it's made me far less of an absolutist in terms of exercise. And it also explained to me why I would train people, let's say with the high intensity Nautilus protocol, 1 set to failure, 8 to 12, and people would get stronger and stronger and stronger. And then they would go away and ski in the wintertime and come back and say, my God, I was exhausted. My legs were burning. I was sore for days, and I thought I was stronger. Why is this happening? And at the time, I didn't have an answer. It didn't make sense to me because they were stronger. All of their weights were up. All of their repetitions were up and had been over a period, say, of 6 months. But the thing is, I couldn't dismiss that because this actually happened. There was a problem here, or a disconnect between the perceived strength increase and the performance in skiing. And that's when I started to look into the body's conservation of energy phenomenon and began to do more research into that, and was like, oh, well, that might explain it. And I think it does, but that's what I think as of July 2019. I don't know that I'll feel that way, exposed to more data and research in another 3 years. But I think the important thing is to, again, seek the truth, but don't be satisfied that you found it.
That's hard though, right? Because you want to feel, I don't know if you've heard this saying, but there's this saying, I think it was Mark Andreessen, the famous investor, entrepreneur, who I heard say this, and I think Doug said on my podcast before, which is a kind of a philosophy for belief. And he says strong beliefs loosely held. So you have strong beliefs, but then once evidence presents itself on the contrary, which is, compelling, then you be prepared to change your mind. But from what you said there, unless I've interpreted that wrongly, it's like you're always a little bit uncertain, and that's quite scary to be in that position. If I understood that correctly, is that kind of, by saying that you never arrive at truth? How do you
I think you often find out, I think what you find out by that exercise is what is not true, or not true in every single situation. And that in itself brings you a little bit closer to the truth. It's a process of elimination, I believe. Will Durant made an interesting statement, and he said that it's very difficult for any human being to stand up and assess or to judge the entirety of the human race. He said it's like a drop of water poised on the crest of a wave that announces it's going to analyze the sea. And there's so much that we do not know. And I that's just, maybe Steve Martin once said that in philosophy, you learn just enough to screw you up for the rest of your life. And that could be a demonstration of it in my case. It could be simply that I have a low boredom threshold. And once I've summited what I believe to be a truth, it would be devastating to me to think, well, that's it. That thrill is gone. There's no other, peak to climb. So then you start to look for other things to examine. And maybe it's a question of breaking down minutia, or things into minutia that don't really require that. Like I say, I don't claim to possess any special knowledge or exhaustive knowledge on any topic. I've been interested in exercise for a long time, and I've looked into it thoroughly and critically for a long time. But I don't give myself any special status whatsoever. My opinions are probably as valid as yours or any one of your listeners. If anything, I might be able to point out some pitfalls that I've made during my foray into this field that could save others from doing the same. But really, if any of us cracked the nut, and let's be honest, that most of us got into this enterprise because we wanted to build bigger, stronger muscles. We wanted to look like, our bodybuilding heroes who were steroid addled. And we haven't figured that out yet. None of us has. Otherwise, we would have that look without the steroids. And clearly that is not the case, whether it's nutrition, whether it's training, whether it's optimal recovery. For most of us, our gains petered out within 5 to 10 years of taking up the enterprise. So, we don't want to accept that. And so we keep going back to the drawing board and seeing if there's something we've missed, some other element that we can incorporate into what we're doing that will realize this vision that we had. And it could be my age. I'm at an age now where that's not a priority anymore. So now it's a question of, well, what can exercise do? And when you see what it can do is rather modest in and of itself, you don't stress over it quite as much as we did when we were younger and believed that it was a panacea.
Yeah, well, I've had the good fortune of talking to you and people like you on this podcast and coming to that realization probably a lot sooner than others. And I feel quite fortunate, and I think perhaps my listeners are quite fortunate as well if they've listened to a lot of these episodes, because it is quite clear that is the case. And it should hopefully help people become less obsessed and divert that energy elsewhere. John, I want to talk to you a little bit about the future of high intensity training for a moment. As we were kind of talking offline, there's a number of these motor-driven resistance exercise machines available now. You've got the likes of ARX, who are a sponsor of my podcast, but there's a number of different manufacturers coming out with their own version at various price points, focused on different markets and things like that. And I know you had or have one in your studio, and I'd be just curious to hear your thoughts on that versus gravity-based resistance machines, and whether you think that we're perhaps as an industry headed more in the direction of these more advanced, quote unquote, more advanced resistance machines in the future.
Yeah, to me, it's interesting. I always like any type of what I would perceive to be innovation in the field that I'm in. And as we talked about and touched on earlier, force is force to your muscles. It can't differentiate whether you're on a chrome-plated Nautilus machine or lifting a bucket of rocks. It just knows how much force is required. And consequently, if something is moving toward you and you resist it to your full capacity, you're producing force and you're fatiguing muscle fibers. And if the people that criticize these machines still subscribe to the inroad theory, which is a momentary weakening of muscles, clearly this is occurring on these new machines. And does it matter to, in the final analysis, whether you train on a gravity-based or a motor-driven machine? Probably not, because you can only produce the force that you can produce. Your muscles can produce. However, what I like about it is that it adapts instantly to whatever force you're producing. So, for example, if you can only produce 3 pounds of force in the bottom position of a bench press, let's say, and that's ridiculously low, but it'll serve for the example, that's what you get. If you can produce 400 pounds of force in the top position where your leverage is better and, bones come into play as well, that's what you get. But as soon as your force output changes or diminishes or increases, that's the force you get. So it's a perfect match to what you're capable of doing. With a gravity-based machine, with the exception of ones that increase the negative factor. I forget the name of the one now. Roger Schwab has a bunch of them in his gym.
The X-Force, yeah.
Yes, X-Force. And before that, Life Fitness came out with one that automatically increased the negative. Most standardized gravity-based machines just give you the weight. It's 100 pounds up, it's 100 pounds down. We all know that for whatever reason, be it internal friction, as Arthur Jones said, or cross-bridge activation, as certain physiologists have said, your negative is always, your ability to produce force on the negative is much greater than the positive. And the problem with that is that, when you do your positive, as you're doing your negative, particularly under control, there's a bit of recovery going on because it's submaximal. And then you do another positive and you do another negative. And eventually, through attrition, you exhaust the muscle. And in terms of efficiency, I like something that isn't death by 1,000 cuts. So I like the machines because your positive it can be, if you so choose, maximum, and your negative can be maximum, and therefore you can reach that level of inroad much quicker, and thus less opening and closing of the joints involved in the activity, and thus less wear and tear. So I do like that feature to it. Now, as far as it being the future of exercise, I would say that, and did say that, mainly because everything seems to be heading to computers anyway. If you want to watch a movie now, it's downloadable. If you want to listen to music, it's downloadable. You can check your pulse rate on a device you wear on your wrist, which is a computer. Everything is going computers, and it's only natural that exercise will. And in fact, it has been going in that direction for at least 20 years now. With it started, I believe, with some of the so-called aerobic devices like Life Cycle, and it went on to the steppers. And so it's only natural that resistance training is going to go that direction too. And in fact, when the Life Fitness machines came out, that's exactly what it was. It was a computer, and you do a press as a test, and it would determine what your strength was, and then it would give you a weight that you could probably do for 10 reps with a 40% heavier negative. Now, the only problem with that, I think, is that if you're able to do 100 pounds and your negative is 140, that's great on your first rep when you're fresh. That negative could be too heavy by your second or third rep. And so you need to have something that adapts specifically to what your force output is. If you're doing it properly, you should be getting weaker with each repetition. Your force output should be diminishing because you've taken something out of the tank with the previous rep. And so that's why I'm not an adversary of what ARCS is doing or what Outstrip is doing with their computerized equipment. I don't know that we're there yet in terms of the perfect exercise device, but I think at least to see it moving in that direction is exciting. It's encouraging. And I think over time it will result in a briefer workout, but a more thorough workout, which is a good thing because, as I said in my book too, the most precious commodity that we have is time. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's what life is made up of. So if we can...
Sorry, John.
No, go ahead.
Finish. I was going to say, are you concerned at all about? So some people have raised concerns about the safety of motor-driven machines.
No, they're.
Go on.
No, I was going to say, as far as safety goes, I've never found anything that is more safe because number one, you can set the range that moves it. It's not like if this machine is going to drive your knees right back behind your ears. No, you can stop it at a right angle. You can preset the range that you're going to operate in. And two, if you find that it's I don't know what's the word. I was going to say dangerous, but if you find that it's uncomfortable or unpleasant or is giving you worry, then stop pushing on it. It's over. It's done. You don't have that luxury with a barbell. If midway through a set it's a problem, particularly if you don't have a spotter, well, guess where that barbell is going to end up? On your chest. And with this one, it's what you get, what you give. If you're going to resist it, and you don't have to resist it at 100%. I mean, you could approach that with a Delorme and Watkins mentality, and just do your first couple of reps at a modest force output, and then try and step it up. And the nice thing about it is that the computer records what your force is, and it retains it for the next time you work out. So now you have a prior performance that you can see. And even know what point in the range of motion your force was greater in the previous workout, as opposed to just a repetition. Last week I did 11 reps, so this week I'm going to do 12 on my exercise machine or my barbell. But the thing there is, did your form slip a little bit when you did your 11th rep last week? What was it in the mid range? We don't know, but with this equipment, we do know. And I think that's hugely helpful. And again, most of the critique against this type of technology has been made by people that sell the other type of technology, just like Joe Weider and company attacked the Nautilus machines when they came out because Weider and Hoffman and those guys sold barbells. It threatened their markets. So I think if you can pan through or sieve through the din of commercial hype and the fact that there is marketing at play constantly on both sides, and just look at it objectively, you can see that it's simply an alternative. And it's an alternative that has, I think, a lot of advantages to it. And I think those advantages will grow as the technology improves.
I assume you have a romantic connection to some of the old Nautilus Med-X pieces, though. Would I be right in saying that?
Oh, for sure. I Nautilus in particular, but that was Arthur Jones was an interesting guy, but I wouldn't have cared about Arthur Jones were it not for Mike Menser. Like Mike was my conduit into that community. And Mike was one of the earliest advocates of Nautilus, and as he said, it made it easier to train harder. And the safety factors I like on machines as opposed to free weights, having been a fellow who's pinned himself under a bench press in his parents' basement numerous times with no one around.
God.
So I liked that. I also liked the writings about the cam and variable resistance and moment arm issues within the cams, and the fact that Jones spent so much time creating these machines and designing these machines before he even released them to the marketplace showed a certain obsession on his part, which I think bodes well. You want someone who's going to manufacture something to really believe in what he's done. And Jones did that. Nautilus did. They did research, which was nice. Of course, the research tended to favor Nautilus, understandably. But, at the end of the day, like I say, I've come to the conclusion that force is force, that the muscles produce. And as Mike said, and I think that was true, Nautilus just made it easier. Those type of machines made it easier to work harder and just focus on contracting the muscles rather than coordination or skill learning or things like that. So, excuse me. I think I'm very nostalgic in that respect for Nautilus. But then, Arthur jumped ship. He created MedX, and then suddenly, the lower back machine of Nautilus wasn't really a lower back machine, but this one is. This is the one you want. And then these equipment. But I think MedX is very good. I think Nautilus is very good, mainly because of the fact that the people that created it, primarily Arthur Jones, although I don't know that he had a hand in the design of the MedX exercise line, we're very passionate and very dedicated to what they did. Other companies simply just wanted to, get in on the machine market, so they had the round pulleys.
Trends,
yeah. And so I've trained in different gyms over the years with different pieces of equipment, and some were terrible, and other ones were okay. And most will give you a decent workout.
Yeah, it's mad to me. Like I was working out in a facility near me recently for the first time, and the machines looked very modern, and I was using them, and you could tell straight away that they didn't have they didn't have a cam, not in the way that Nautilus and MedX has. So you could feel that the resistance curve wasn't the same, the friction wasn't quite the same, and it's just crazy to me how that technology doesn't seem to have carried through in the newer sort of gravity weight-based machines. The generations of weight-based machines, it doesn't seem as carried through, which is strange. Do you know why that is? I'm sure that's probably been talked about on the show, but do you have a view on that?
I'm not privy to any knowledge on that front. I think the way that most companies are run, they're run by marketing people. And I know when Nautilus sold in the 80s, that what happened was the new owners came and they were just looking for a brand to sell. They didn't care about Nautilus's history or the fact that Nautilus believed that you could achieve total fitness through resistance training, because the new company had also purchased Schwinn Bike. So they were quite happy to keep things categorized. If you want cardio, Schwinn Bike. If you want strength, Nautilus. So they went against all of the research that Nautilus had done in order to sell product. And I think they also took a look at the machines themselves. The machines that Arthur Jones created were big. As he said, they're as big as they are and as ugly as they are to do the job they have to do. And they had chains and they had cams and they had a lot of steel and they took up a lot of space. And so the first thing that I believe the manufacturers did was they looked at it and said, well, how much money do we have in steel in this thing? Because they recognized if they could still sell it at the same price, but if the production costs were cheaper, the profits were bigger. And they immediately reduced the size or the footprint of the machine, so there's less steel. They reduced the size of the cams, so there's less aluminum. They removed the chains and replaced them with Kevlar belts. And, of course, you have to rationalize that, so it was smoother, it was less friction, but I mean, in some respects, friction is resistance. The Nautilus machines, which were loaded with friction, according to people that sold their own machines in later years that didn't make use of the cam or the chains, seem to have put a lot of muscle on a lot of people. Casey Viator comes to mind. A lot of the professional football players that Nautilus trained, they didn't suffer from too much friction in the equipment. But if you're going to sell a new machine, you got to carve out your own niche. So friction then became the bugbear of the high intensity community. I can see where if you do a rep and the plate sticks, okay, you got a problem. Not only But I mean, that's that's almost the opposite problem. That's zero friction because it's not moving. So it's all been about marketing for the most part. And really the objective is to apply force to the muscles and have them output energy and recruit fibers to a meaningful level so that an adaptation takes place. And if you keep your eye on that, you recognize that, the source of it is only important in terms of safety issues. Is it wear and tear? Is it high force coming back to you in this quest of fatiguing your muscles to a meaningful degree? And I think in some respects there have been evolutions to diminish that. And in other ones, it's just been marketing that people have bought into uncritically.
John, this is fun as always. Do you want to just, before I guess I direct the listeners to the blog post and all of that, what do you want to just mention where they can pick up a copy of the Time Savers workout book?
To my knowledge, it's available in all online bookstores. Amazon comes to mind because it has branches all over the world. And it should be in most local bookstores, but it's not always the case. So probably your best bet is just to go to, whichever Amazon is in your country and order it there.
Yeah, and highly recommend it. I read it myself in PDF form, which wasn't very fun on my e-reader because I couldn't highlight it properly. But apart from that, I'm very grateful for the free version from you. So
no problem.
but no, it's I highly recommend it. Definitely some new things in there that weren't in Body by Science, and new take on things. So I recommend the listeners check that one out. John, what's the best way for people to find out more about you?
I don't know. We do have a website. I'm sorry, I don't know the address of it. For Nautilus North, which is our gym. And there is, I don't know if there's much information about me, but there is information about what we do. And most of the other information, I'm presuming that most listeners are probably interested in exercise, and that information, as against information about me personally, is available in any of the books that I've written.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. If you just type your name into Amazon, you can see your entire library of work. So that's another way of finding all of your titles that you've either published yourself or co-authored. Okay, cool. So for all the listeners, to find the blog post for this episode, please go to highintensitybusiness.com/time-saver-2. I'm not sure if that's the most elegant URL, but it's the best I can think of right now. And for all episodes, please go to highintensitybusiness.com/podcast. And until next time, thank you very much for listening.
Discover how to achieve your health and fitness goals, become a great personal trainer, and build a successful high-intensity training business. Check out highintensitybusiness.com. highintensitybusiness.com.